begin with, one thing we all know, the international system is inherently discriminatory in nature. And the reason why it is discriminatory, because the system is built on structural inequalities. And it is not like that some rules are biased. The entire system is designed in a way that perpetuates inequality at every level, from rule making to rule application. So almost every rule is designed and applied in a way that tend to favor rich, powerful Western countries. Now, to give you a clear insight of this claim that the system is biased, take an example of TRIPS agreement under WTO. When Europe and US were industrializing during the early modern period, around 18th or 19th century, there was no strict intellectual property regime. In fact, many of today's developed countries had weak or flexible IP laws, which allowed them to copy the innovations, adapt new development in fields of technology, and that eventually helped them build their domestic industrial base. And US specifically, during that time, was one of the biggest beneficiary of this weak IP regime. Take a classic example of this man. His name was Samuel Slater. He was indeed known as the father of industrial revolution in America. Now the short story is that this man was working as an apprentice in textile mills in UK, working on some advanced technology at that time. Now UK had prohibited the transfer of that technology, and even skilled laborers working in these mills were not allowed to leave the country. Since technology transfer was prohibited in UK, this man memorized the machine design while working there, and then one day he secretly migrated to US. In fact, US was so backward at that time that Slater couldn't even find a single mechanic to build a spinning machine from his memorized design. It took him nearly 4 years to build this water-powered spinning machine from the knowledge he carried. And from there, US began its journey of industrialization. The US did not enforce British intellectual property claims, and in fact, actively encouraged this kind of technology transfer. And not just this, there are numerous examples of US doing similar acts at that time, which are now considered as theft in international language. So, for over 200 years, these countries followed this path for their development, and now when they are highly developed, they have this audacity to enforce rules they themselves disregarded in the process. And once they gained technological and economic lead, they changed the rules of the game. They brought in TRIPS agreement, through which they globalized strict patent regimes. Now, after all that happened, consider the situation in which developing countries found themselves. Now, developing countries today are at a similar inflection point where US was once standing in 18th or 19th century. But unlike US, they are not allowed to imitate or reverse engineer freely. In fact, they have to pay high licensing fees and wait for long patent duration. And even after all that, they have to operate under tight legal restriction. Take another example. Compulsory licensing under TRIPS. In theory, it allows country to produce a patented product without the patent holder's consent. For example, a life-saving drug in situations of public interest. But in practice, it comes with strict procedural requirements, like prior negotiation with the patent holder, limitations on export, and case-by-case approvals, which make the use of these compulsory licensing legally complex and kind of politically sensitive. This thing actually handicapped countries like India to produce and export life-saving vaccines during COVID. So what TRIPS actually did is that it locked in technological advantage that these developing countries gained during their developmental phase, and then restricted the latecomers from catching up. In fact, this is often termed as kicking away the ladder. meaning denying others the same pathway to development that you yourself used. Let's take another example. Five countries developed nuclear weapons and then collectively decided that no one else should have them. So they created a system where nuclear weapon states keep their arsenal and non-nuclear states are prohibited from developing weapons. So you might think that developing countries were fool enough to give up their rights. In fact, they were fools, but not in accepting the terms, but in believing what nuclear states had offered to them. These five countries promised that they will disarm themselves and destroy all stockpiles of nuclear weapon over a period of time, given that every other country commit themselves not to develop any such weapon. So clearly there was no harm in accepting the offer, as far as these five countries stick to their promise. But it never happened. Decades have passed, and instead of disarming, they have expanded and modernized their arsenals. So again, the rules were designed to freeze power in the hands of a few people. And now the bias doesn't stop at rule making. It continues in rule application as well. Whether rules are enforced or ignored depends on who you are aligned with. If Israel develops a nuclear weapon, then there is total silence. No one in the world or in global community say any word about it. But when India tested a nuclear weapon, it faced decades of sanctions. When Iran pursued a nuclear program, suddenly it becomes a global crisis. And now you can see yourself what is happening with Iran. So the same rule is applied differently depending on power and alignment. Now, developing countries are fully aware that the system is biased. The rules are unequal. And even more, their application is selective. But it poses an important question. If the system is so unfair, why do countries follow these rules at all? Why not these countries come together and oppose this unjust international order? So to understand this, consider a hypothetical situation. A situation where there is a neighborhood and this neighborhood has certain basic rules. Rules like do not steal, do not assault your neighbor, or do not dump garbage on the streets, or do not park your vehicle in no parking zone, etc., etc. But there is a catch, important condition to this neighborhood, that there will be no police, no court, no jail, nothing at all. In short, there will be no external enforcement mechanism to compel people to follow these rules. Now, in such a situation, do you think people would still follow the rules, given there is no one who can force them in following the rules? Interestingly, yes, many people still would oblige with these normative declarations. In fact, think of it other way around. Even when there is even when there is a traffic signal with no police around, not everyone jumps the red light, right? Many people still choose to stop, isn't it? So clearly, enforcement alone cannot explain why rules are followed. There must be something that nudges people to align their behavior, their responses, their actions around these rules and obligations. Which again brings us to an important question. Why do people continue to follow rules even in the absence of external enforcement? And there can be multiple reasons to it. For example, some people might follow rules because they genuinely believe it is the right thing to do. It is like a moral conviction. Their behavior is guided by internal values. They do not constantly question the system. They see rule following as an ethical duty. But this doesn't apply uniformly, right? Imagine a person whose children haven't eaten for days, and this person has no job, no social support, and no options left whatsoever. So for him, it becomes a question of survival: either die of hunger or steal food. In that situation, moral conviction alone may not be strong enough to restrain behavior. So what it implies that for some, internal values are enough to ensure compliance. For others, survival overrides morality, especially in extreme conditions. And we are not getting into whether that is right or wrong. The point is simply that in some cases, rule following comes from within. Clear? Secondly, some people might follow rules because of social pressure. They do not want to stand out or be seen as the odd one out in the society. Their behavior is shaped by how they are perceived by others. So here, image perception takes central stage. Take example of social norms. Most of them are not even legally enforceable, yet people still follow them. Why? Because society has its own informal ways of enforcing rules. For example, consider intercaste marriage in India. There is nothing illegal about it. The law is clearly on your side, yet many people still avoid it. Why? Because of social pressure, the fear of backlash, the fear of judgment, the fear of exclusion. All this makes people conform to the social system. So it becomes a kind of herd mentality. People follow rules not because they fully agree with them, but because they want to avoid social consequences. And that can be the second reason compliance is driven by social pressure. Third reason can be like people might follow rules out of rational self interest. They are not driven by morally or socially or social pressure. They have simply made a cost benefit calculation. For example, you do not steal from your neighbor today because you know it could come back to you tomorrow. Take something as simple as traffic signal. Even when there is no traffic police, you still stop at a red light. Not necessarily because you feel morally obligated or others are watching you, but because you understand the risk. If you jump the signal, you might get hit. So your behavior is guided by calculation, not some kind of conviction. And interestingly, the same person might behave differently in a different situation. Late at night, when the roads are empty, you might choose to cross the signal because now your calculations tells you the risk is minimal. So the rule hasn't changed, but your assessment of cost and benefit has. So the third reason can be compliance driven by rational choice. And there is another reason, habitual compliance. Some people follow rules simply because obedience feels like the easier option. It is low cost in the immediate sense. They have always followed rules, so they never really pause to question them. Because the moment you try to challenge a rule, whether for the right reason or the wrong, it creates a friction, a kind of discomfort, even may bring you into a conflict. And most people just want to avoid that immediate pain. So over time, rule following becomes automatic. It turns into a habit, almost a default setting. And that's the fourth reason, compliance driven by habit, not reflection. Now, now considering all these reasons, the key observation we can find here is that all four types of people we discussed above are following the same rule but for completely different reasons. So rules do not hold because of single enforcement mechanism. They hold because of a combination of motivations operating at the same time. Now think of international politics in the same way. It is like a neighborhood where states are like individuals and international rules are like the norms of that neighborhood. Clear? From this, we can draw two important conclusions. First, there is no central authority to enforce rules. There is no power above sovereign states. In international relations, this is called a state of anarchy. And anarchy here doesn't mean chaos. It simply means no government above governments. Right? Second conclusion we can draw from this hypothetical situation is that even without a central authority, states still follow rules, which means there must be other reasons that are driving compliance, just like we saw in case of individuals. And and this is exactly what different schools of thought in international relations try to explain. They study the behavior of state, identify patterns, and then try to answer a basic question: why do states follow rule in an anarchic system? Now, to understand these reasons in detail, we will look at major schools of thought in IR. The first of which is realism, the second is liberalism, and the third is constructivism. Now, starting with realism, first let me put down the core idea itself, and later we will try to understand it. It says that states follow rules only when it serves their interest. So this is our core idea. And if you take a closer look, then you will see that there is a kind of parallelism between rational choice making and realism to some extent. Now, as you may know, realism is the oldest and perhaps the most influential school in IR. If we trace its historical roots, then it might go back to the 5th century BC, where Thucydides was writing about the Peloponnesian War. Then in the late medieval to early modern period, we come across this man, Niccolo Machiavelli, in 16th century Florence. Then there is another man here, Thomas Hobbes, in 17th century England, giving us some insight about structural realities. Further in modern times, Hans Morgenthau expanded the scope of realism with his book Politics Among Nations in 1948, which was further developed by another man named Kenneth Walls, who wrote Theory of International Politics in 1979, and John Mearsheimer writing The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001. So all these thinkers developed the idea of realism in IR. Right? Okay. So now moving forward to the central claim of realist, that countries follow international rules when convenient and violate these rules when it serves their purpose otherwise. Now, what happened? How did realists arrive at this conclusion that international rules are followed according to the convenience? The realists studied various historical examples, and one of those was Peloponnesian War during 5th century BC, precisely between 431 BC to 405 BC. This war was such a major historical event, even regarded as something like the World War of that time. So, to give you a brief account of it, at that time there were two powerful city states, namely Sparta and Athens. Once they were very close friends, even the combined forces once defeated the greatest empire of that time, the Persian Empire. They were that close. Soon after, both started growing in power and created a kind of alliance system, something like we have seen during the World War I period. One camp, led by Sparta, was called the Peloponnesian League, as one you can see here in green color. The other camp, led by Athens, was known as the Delian League, as shown in purple color here. So, without going into the details of how and why things worsened between the two leagues, the key fact that concerns us is that the Delian League, led by Athens, started a war with Peloponnesian League. Now, during the war, there was another city-state called Melos. It was formally aligned with Peloponnesian League, but during the war, Melos was sitting quiet, not taking part from either side. Now, what happened is that Athens one day decided that they had to capture Melos. So Athens sent its envoy to Melos, demanding either to submit or face destruction. This conversation between Athenian envoy and the Melian statesman is recorded by Thucydides in his work History of the Peloponnesian War, and is often referred to as the Melian dialogue. The Melian statesman argued that it is immoral and irrelevant to attack a neutral and weak state. And at that moment, the Athenian envoy stated something that formed the central argument of realists forever. What they told Melos was, The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This becomes the central theme of all realist reasoning, and this incident, among others, gave rise to three connected propositions of realism, which are first, anarchy, second, trust deficit, and the third is relative power. Now, anarchy, you must all be aware by now that there is no central authority to enforce rule. In IR, that means there is no government above the central governments. So, all of you know it, and I need not to further elaborate it. The only thing to remember here is that in IR, anarchy is not some kind of a problem to be solved. It is a kind of permanent structural condition we are presented with, and nothing can be done about that. At most, we can manage it, and IR is all about managing our affairs in this state of anarchy. Now, coming to the second proposition, which is trust deficit. It says that states cannot fully trust each other. It may happen that a state might have good intentions toward us today, but you cannot be sure about tomorrow. We have seen that in case of Sparta and Athens, who were once very close friends. In fact, in today's time, a good friendship can turn into a bitter one at any point of time. For example, take India and Bangladesh. Under Sheikh Hasina's regime, Bangladesh was a good friend of India. We made some landmark progresses in bilateral relations, be it the India-Bangladesh land boundary agreement, or many infrastructure projects undertaken, or the issue of illegal migration. So there were numerous examples of growing friendship. But when the leadership changed in Bangladesh, the equation turned totally upside down. India became one of the prime enemies for Bangladesh, and there is nothing shocking about that. For an IR student, this is the structural reality. You cannot trust another state forever. Anything might come up, and once good friends can become bitter enemies. So, if a question comes in mains about the present state of affairs between India and Bangladesh, always mention it from this perspective. Clear? Now, coming back, the key conclusion here is that you cannot trust the intention of another state. No matter what you do, there will always be a trust deficit. And we should accept that and plan our foreign policies accordingly. Now, given these two structural realities, anarchical system and trust deficit, how should one prepare for the uncertainties in IR? Here comes the third proposition of realism, that is, relative power. In fact, this was the most profound learning from the Million incident. The only way to survive in an anarchic system where states cannot trust the intentions of other participants is by increasing relative power. Power becomes the ultimate guarantee for your own security, and it is not absolute power. You just need to be more powerful than other participants in the system. Take the example of Russia-Ukraine war. Once Ukraine had the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. When USSR disintegrated, it voluntarily gave up its nuclear stockpiles in order to set a good example. It trusted the intention of Russia, that it would not threaten its integrity and sovereignty. But you can see what happened then. Do you think that had Ukraine not given up its nuclear weapon, Russia would dare to invade Ukraine? No, not even in dreams. Nuclear weapons were the ultimate guarantee of Ukrainian sovereignty, which it gave up foolishly. So, to secure your own survival, you need to increase your relative power and not diminish it. Fine. Now, to connect all these three propositions of realism with the central argument that states follow rules as per their convenience. In other words, if following rules, the benefit outweighs the cost, the state would readily comply with the international rules. And for a state, benefit as per realists are often counted in terms of relative power. If compliance with the international system increases relative power, the state would be more than happy to abide by it. But when following rules increases the cost or benefit, states start disregarding the international order. Now the rules are not favoring the increase in relative power. Instead, they are coming in the way of it. take example of China. Since 1980s, China opened up its economy. Despite being a communist country, it adopted a largely capitalist economic structure. It happily participated in institutions like WTO, UN Security Council, and broader Bretton Woods institutions. But now, these institutions and the rules within them are increasingly seen as constraints on its further rise. So what China is doing is blatantly disregarding international rules, as you can see from multiple incidents in the South China Sea. So if a question comes about China's growing presence in South China Sea, then you should add the realist perspective to your answer. Now you know why China is standing in contempt of the international system. Clear? Now, all things good, when every consideration is now precipitated into relative power, a negative outcome of this is what is often called as Thucydides' trap, or what Kenneth Waltz described as security dilemma. It means that when every state is now engaged in increasing its relative power, the act of making oneself more secure may make other states feel insecure. It might happen that one state is increasing its power for defensive purpose, but others see it as a threat. This is because power has a dual nature. It might be accumulated for defensive purposes, but given the trust deficit, it can be used for offensive purposes as well. Now this creates a cycle of mutual suspicion. And if this cycle continues, tension may escalate and eventually precipitate into an outright war, like what happened between Britain and Germany prior to the World War I. So this dilemma of where to stop or whether to keep moving ahead with the agenda of increasing relative power creates a trap which is often called as Thucydides trap, a trap which may eventually lead to a war. In fact, the term Thucydides trap was coined by Graham Allison, who found 16 cases over the last 500 years where rising powers challenged a ruling power, resulting into 12 wars. So this is all what realism has to say about why country follows rules, even when there is no external enforcement, because the benefits of operating within the system outweigh the cost of standing in conflict with it. Apart from it, another question that realism answers is, why are countries engaged in power-seeking behavior? So, one line of thought we already know, it is necessitated by structural realities, and power is the key determinant of survival here. This is something similar to what Kenneth Waltz has explained in his book Theory of International Politics, also known as structural realism or neorealism. According to this view, it is the structure of the international system, especially anarchy, that compels state to focus on survival and security. Another reasoning for this was given by Hans Morgenthau in 1948. He described power as the central axis of national interest. In other words, he equated national interest to relative power. So, whenever you read about any action taken in national interest in IR, it is basically a drive either to increase one's own power or to create constraint for others to acquire power. For example, US action in Venezuela is publicly framed as action against drugs and organized crime. But under the surface, it is also about curbing Chinese influence in Latin America, especially in Venezuela. So Morgenthau in his book Politics Among Nations made a fundamental claim that politics is governed by the drive for power. According to him, statesmen who ignore this drive and instead pursue an idealistic rule-based order without backing of power are not moral. They are dangerous because they will be defeated by those who understand the reality of the international system. He says that power-seeking behavior is rooted in human nature, as states are ruled by leaders, and it is the nature of humans to engage in acquisition of power. Leaders who choose not to engage in this drive might put themselves and their state in a difficult situation. So again, we have classical example of this. Jawaharlal Nehru, being idealist in nature, thought that we are a peace-loving nation, and if we are not harming anyone, then why would any other country pose a danger to us? Isn't it? So he might not have been aware of the peace-loving mellows, but soon he came to this hard realization when China attacked India in 1962. So the idealist approach could not save India from aggression. Contrary to this, Walt says that drive to acquire power is independent of human nature. The structure of international system itself incentivizes power accumulation. It is not a matter of choice of an individual leader. Sooner or later, the structure of international system forces national leaders to acquire power, even if they do not want to. So, after 1962, India realized this reality. The leader was still Nehru, but he understood that his idealistic bent of mind cannot save the state from structural realities. From there onward, India started preparing itself on multiple fronts. So, to summarize it, states that do not respond to structural incentives get eliminated or dominated in the global community. The system selects power-seeking behavior, even if individual leaders would prefer otherwise. But does realism answer all instances where rule following happens? Clearly, this argument of power-seeking behavior fails to explain many real-world situations. If states follow rules only when it is convenient, then why do we see so much rule following that is obviously not convenient? We have seen states contributing monetarily to international organizations that sometimes rules against them. They comply with dispute settlement mechanism of institutions like WTO even when they lose their cases. They extradite criminals to other countries even at a domestic political cost. We have seen this during UP regime when India extradited the Italian Marine despite a huge domestic uproar against it. Further, realism also fails to explain cooperation in the absence of a hegemon. There are areas of genuine international cooperation, like in aviation safety, or in marine navigation, or disease surveillance, where no single power is forcing compliance, and there is no clear question of convenience or inconvenience. So, to understand this gap, we will now proceed to our next school of thought, that is liberalism.